everyone, Doc T here with another episode of The Horse's Advocate. This is going to be called Equine Metabolic Syndrome Part 2. The reason it's Part 2, obviously, is there's a Part 1, which I did last week. If you haven't listened to that one, you might want to take a gander over there and listen to it. There is a lot of information on that first episode, which I realized wasn't yet complete and didn't answer all the questions. In fact, it made me ask other questions. So I did a little bit of digging, and with the help of other experts in the field, mostly human metabolic syndrome, I was able to come up with some ideas that I think are going to prove useful to you and to your horses. So my intention is to start off with a short podcast. In other words, the meat and potatoes of metabolic syndrome in horses. But you know me, and I'll probably make it and end up making it an hour long, and I apologize up front for that. But let's look at some of the things in human metabolic syndrome that are important for us to understand. The first is that metabolic syndrome is probably behind almost every disease that's killing humans on the planet. The three biggest ones are cardiovascular disease, heart attacks, basically strokes, things like that. Second is cancer, and third is cognitive decline, which could not only include Alzheimer's, but dementia, Lewy body, Parkinson's, everything in the brain seems to be tied back. All three of these major diseases seem to tie back to a metabolic crisis that's occurring in our bodies, either acutely or over time. And my thesis is, in horses, we are seeing the same thing. Obviously, we're not getting cardiovascular disease in the form of strokes and heart attacks in horses, but we certainly are seeing laminitis in horses that usually used to be a fat pony syndrome. We are also seeing more and more cancer cases, which is still surprising because it shouldn't be. And then, of course, dementia, it's hard. We don't test for that in horses. Because horses really aren't mentally challenged. They seem to know where the food is and how to get out of the rain. So those aren't happening. But I'd say probably in the top three problems with horses secondary to metabolic syndrome is breakdown of connective tissue. And I've told you before that this is probably because we're consuming all of our protein. And with that, we see in humans the number one cause of death in people older than 65 of all causes is falling down. And when you fall down, you end up breaking bones, and there's your demise. Most people, if you break a bone after 65, such as your hip or your leg or something like that, there's a good chance that you're not going to survive more than 2 or 3 years. It's just, that's the statistics. And the number one reason why bones break is, yes, osteoporosis and lack of calcium in there, but it's also lack of muscle that surrounds our bones and prevents us from protecting ourselves. That's what one of the objects of muscles. Muscles not only help us move, obviously, they protect us in falls. They also are a great storage system for glucose, which prevents all these problems. So metabolic syndrome is so important and is based on a perfect system that has been created over a period of time that is almost unthinkable for most of us. If you're young listening to this, you might say, gosh, 50 years seems like ancient history. If you're like me, I still remember what 50 years ago was like. But it's hard for us to wrap our heads around the fact that humans and horses have evolved over hundreds of thousands of years and certainly millions of years to function perfectly in the environment, the ecosystem that we have. You can talk all you want about microbiome, which I do a lot, but that also has evolved to live in symbiosis, meaning together, effortlessly in each one of us. And in the past 50 years, things have changed so drastically. In the 50 years I've been with horses since 1973, We didn't have a lot of these diseases. I just listed 12 of them for somebody, 12 diseases that I didn't think were in the textbooks, or if they were, they weren't that common in horses, from anhydrosis, kissing spine, nephrosplenic ligament entrapments, fractured cheek teeth, EOTRH for the incisors and canine teeth. Then, of course, we have insulin resistance, Cushing's disease, drop fetlocks, DSLD, suspensory ligaments, like an epidemic out there. All these things just weren't there 50 years ago. They weren't there 40 years ago, or they were just starting to show their face. And now it's unusual to find somebody who's not seen one or two of these diseases. It just seems like they're so common. And this is why I want to spend some time on metabolic syndrome in horses. And unfortunately, I don't have a lot of information that is directly from research in horses. It's either because I'm not spending enough time digging into the research, or I'm spending too much time in human research. But in my goings on from farm to farm, I'm not finding a lot of people understanding what these things are, what insulin resistance is. I don't understand why farriers and veterinarians together aren't combating laminitis by helping the hoof and feeding the hoof so it doesn't have these problems. But it's up to you listening to this podcast to make the changes you want. And I have two things to tell you before I dig right in. Number one, I am so grateful to each and every one of you who have listened to this, have passed it on, have helped other horses. I was approached by a trainer right here in my hometown who say, "Oh, you're Dr. Tucker. Aren't you the nutrition guy?" I said, "Yeah, I've been talking a lot about it." She says, "I have a friend who listened to your advice and completely turned her horse around. The horse is doing so well, it's beyond words." And she convinced her trainer, and everybody in that barn now is on all forage diet, limiting sugar intake, and feeding soybean meal as their protein source. And they will never go back. They are certainly seeing the improvements in their horses. So to each and every one of you out there listening to this, who never comment, who never pick up the phone and say, "Hey, doc, this is great," because you don't know me, you don't know how to get in touch with me, you don't, whatever, it doesn't matter. None of us really have the time to do that. I just want to let you know that I know that I'm helping some people, and those people are helping others, and those people are helping more. And there's a exponential effect that I am so grateful for. So thank you from the bottom of my heart. Thank you so much. The second thing was, I was trying to explain to the worker at this farm why she shouldn't feed senior feed or low starch feed. And I was getting rid of the whole routines that you all have heard me say before. And she just put her hands up and said, "Stop. I don't have time. I am busy. I'm got all these horses to take care of." And there are like 50 horses at the place. And she was in charge of making sure they're all done up right for the afternoon. And she says, "Just tell me the bottom line." And for her and for all of you listening to this who don't want to listen to me anymore, or just only have a few minutes, it's simply this. If you start feeding the horse the way it has evolved to be fed, you're going to be miles ahead. And I'll tell you why. Number one, they don't have the exercise that they used to have. In other words, they don't have the ability to walk from here into there, like from Florida to Kentucky and back again in a year. They're stuck behind a fence. Yes, they run around. Yes, you work them hard. We're not going to talk about racehorses because they're youngsters, and youngsters are so, they just incredibly have the ability, human or horse, to overcome these things. It's when they hit the about 10 years of age on up, and they either become sedentary or they don't have a lot of work, that they all fall apart. So exercise is important. Eating is correctly to what we call get energy balance. And third, try to reduce all the stress in their lives. And putting a horse in a stall or behind a fence is inherently stressful for every horse. It's meant to be free and run the plains. But they also don't have to worry about being attacked by bobcats or fighting for their their mates or whatever. I don't know. There's, it's a balance. You and I are the same way. We don't have to hunt today. We just have to run down to McDonald's to get our burger. So thank you for her reminding me that I don't want to get too complicated today. Okay. So I want to talk first about fat. And I don't mean the fat that you eat, but the fat that's on our bodies. And the fat that's on our bodies are broken down into two basic categories. You have that subcutaneous fat, and I'm going to call it adipose tissue, because fat's fancy word is adipose tissue, and we're going to call it subcutaneous. That's the fat that's underneath our skin, that's in our love handles or in our buttocks, that are on our arms. That's called subcutaneous fat, or subcutaneous adipose tissue, or SAT. That's opposed to the other one called visceral adipose tissue, or VAT, not value added tax for all you people who have that in your country, but visceral adipose tissue. And VAT versus SAT is what I want to talk about for just a second. If your fat is stored on your body in any other place other than subcutaneous, it is doing damage. So in other words, when you have VAT around your in your pancreas, where your insulin is created, inside the muscle cells, intracellular fat, or in your liver, or anywhere else, you're going to get inflammation. And the inflammation is called adipokines. Some people pronounce it adipokines. Cytokines are cells that are inflammatory. Maybe if you remember the pandemic, people talking about a cytokine storm, that's basically what we're talking about. The cytokines are being released. This is why people with excess visceral fat had trouble fighting off COVID, because their visceral fat already had inflammation so high from their adipokines. So here's an interesting fact in humans, and it answered for me so many questions. If you look at all humans that have human metabolic disease as defined by whatever standard that you want to use, and there's several different ways you can look at it, but they're definitely diagnosed as metabolic syndrome. They're probably insulin resistance. They have a poor insulin response. They have high blood pressure. Their girth size is over 40 inches in men. I think it's 38 in women. They all have the signs of cardiovascular disease coming on, and they're basically metabolically unfit. What I found interesting is, of the 100 million people that have metabolic syndrome in the United States, 2/3 of those people are technically obese. Now think about that for just a second, because if you're listening, you're going to say, well, does that mean the other third are not technically obese? And the answer is yes. This answers the question, why does that thin person drop dead of a heart attack? Why does the person or the horse that seems to be a hard keeper, why do they get laminitis? I know that we had a horse like that. The horse that doesn't look fat, yet is breaking down. What's going on? And the result is, it's the ratio, well, not the ratio, but the total amount of subcutaneous fat that a person has. So that's variable. And some people, they've always been lean all their lives. And then, there's other people who are overweight all their lives. But when I say overweight, excess body fat. But the difference is, if a person can store the excess calories that they're putting in their mouth as body subcutaneous adipose tissue, SAT, then they're not going to get visceral adipose tissue, or VAT. And if you don't get visceral adipose tissue, the following things are not going to happen. Number one, if you don't have the accumulation of intracellular fat in the muscles, you're always going to have insulin sensitivity. What I mean by that is the more fat that starts to accumulate inside the muscle cell, the more the muscle cell is going to not be able to allow insulin to bind to it so glucose can be entered into the cell. Just remember from the previous podcast, glucose comes to the cell wall and triggers a response that sends a transport mechanism to the surface that creates a hole in the surface that allows sugar to fall in. And when that process doesn't occur, then insulin is resisted. It is turned away from the muscle cell, and that technically is what insulin resistance is. So you don't want accumulation of fat inside the muscle cells. And that comes very quickly with a sedentary lifestyle, coupled with increased glucose intake. The second thing that can happen is you get increase of fat within the liver. And the liver doesn't really want to hold on to fat. But when it does, it will start to increase something called VLDL. Now, a lot of you have heard of HDL and LDL as cholesterol. Well, they're not cholesterol. Sorry, even if your doctor still calls it that, they're wrong. HDL is high density lipoprotein. Lipoprotein is a shipping container into which triglycerides, free fatty acids, and cholesterol can accumulate and be shipped in the water of the blood. And, you know, fat and water don't mix, so the fat has to be put into a shipping container. That's what lipoprotein is. So you have HDL and LDL. LDL is low-density lipoprotein, but they've discovered that there's a very low-density lipoprotein, or VLDL. And the liver will increase that. And with that, they will put in large amounts of triglycerides, but they don't put in a lot of cholesterol in there. So now you have this higher amount of cholesterol to triglyceride ratio. And the low-density lipoprotein, LDH or LDL, is increased in numbers. So they increase the number of LDL, and so your LDL starts to rise. But as they increase it, they also decrease the size of the shipping container. So it's smaller. It's called a smaller particle size. And when you have increased LDL of small particle size, that's what gets stuck in the blood and starts to form these atherosclerotic regions that leads to strokes and cardiovascular disease. So it's secondary to eating too much fat and sugar, and that being converted over into liver fat, and liver fat causing the increased VLDLs, increased LDLs, or what they call the bad cholesterol, and that's what circulates through your blood and kills you. I don't know what it does in horses. I haven't seen that. I would love to have somebody who's an expert on to talk to me about that. And of course, the third thing is when fat infiltrates the pancreas and the islet cells, it's the beta islet cells that produce insulin. And when you invade that area with adipokines, you're going to get a decreased insulin production. All right, so I just dove in deep into the weeds and told you that if you start accumulating fat in the visceral, in the anything but the subcutaneous fat, they're going to release inflammatory actions that are going to cause damage to the body. It's that simple. I mean, we don't even have to go any further, but you do have to realize one important thing. The ratio of that, or the visceral adipose tissue, to the subcutaneous adipose tissue can be small. In other words, any amount of visceral fat that you're starting to accumulate can lead to big problems. And in humans, they're trying hard to detect this earlier rather than later. And people are looking at hemoglobin A1C as a marker, and that if you've got an abnormal hemoglobin A1C, it's because you already have a problem. So the one test that we do in humans and can be done in horses easily is an oral glucose tolerance test. And this is fascinating because it can detect insulin resistance in the mere infancy stages. It can detect non-alcoholic fatty liver disease before it's a problem. Fatty liver in humans is an epidemic right now. It's the leading cause of cirrhosis and liver transplant replacement. And I read someplace that 44% of all donated livers are rejected after they're biopsied because they're already bad. They can't put a bad liver into somebody who's replacing their liver. So it's running rampant in the human world. And I believe it's probably running rampant in horses, although I don't know of anybody who's routinely doing liver biopsies or running blood tests to look at liver functions in relation to metabolic syndrome. But the oral glucose tolerance test is really easy. You fast the horse, and you and your vet are going to talk about the ins and outs of this. This is just a general overview. And then, so overnight fast, the vet gets there in the morning, and a dose of glucose is given to the horse, and a blood test is drawn before the dosing, and then 30, 60, 90 minutes later, maybe 120 minutes later. So it's a 2-hour test with the vet doing nothing much in between. So what's interesting is when you and I, if we're normal and we take a bolus of glucose, our blood sugar is going to peak in about 30 minutes. It's just going to rise right up there. And along with that rise, you're going to get a rise in insulin that's going to drive the glucose out of the blood and bring it back down to normal levels. And when the blood glucose comes down, insulin drops down. So if you looked at two lines going from left to right on any graph, they would both spike and peak at about 30 minutes. And by 2 hours, they're all back down to normal. Everything's fine. That's normal. Okay, if you're borderline of insulin resistance, you're going to have a delay in the insulin getting out there. So the glucose is going to peak at 30 minutes, but instead of the insulin peaking, it's slow to get off the mark. And so the blood glucose can linger there a little bit longer. And if you recall, blood running around free without an escort is going to cause a problem in the lining of the vessels. So that is the beginning of atherosclerosis. And my hypothesis is that's the beginning of laminitis in horses. The third stage is a very late insulin peak at 2 hours. So it's the delayed insulin peak just goes way further out. So the sugar goes up and the insulin's just having a tough time getting off the mark. And that's because you have inflammation in so many areas that the insulin isn't able to get out there. It also means that the insulin, it's not just decreased production, but you're also probably having a whopping dose of glucose going in the mouth, and they're just not making enough. It's like, if you're normal, then you go out and you go to the fairgrounds and you eat, a couple of things of cotton candy and then you have a sugar this and a Slurpee of that. The next thing you know, your sugar is off the charts and your insulin is having a tough time keeping up with it. The fourth out of five, the fourth one is that you have this huge production of insulin with a normal glucose. So that means that you're dumping a lot of glucose and your insulin is just right out there working at it. But there's like 2, 3, 4 times more insulin than you should have. It's called an insulin spike. And insulin's doing its job. It's trying to bail the boat out that's leaking. And so, yeah, you're still staying afloat, but it's not as efficient or as effective. And of course, the fifth level is that no insulin occurs. So you have the glucose spike and it just stays up and it lingers and doesn't go away because the islet cells are exhausted. They're just not giving any more. And any more insulin. So insulin's everything. Insulin is a hormone that is a protein. So it goes back to we need more protein. But we also need to limit the amount of sugar that goes in. So how do we do that? I think we do that if we just think about something that I call an equation. Equation just means you put an equal sign, you just draw an equal sign. And on the left side, whatever you write there has to be equal to whatever's on the right side. So you could put on the left side 4 + 1 = 3 + 2, because that means 5 = 5. So they're two different things, but they're equal. They're balanced. It's called energy balance. So the amount of energy going in has to be equal to the energy that's coming out to hold your own. Now, when you're growing, that still applies. You just have to put more energy in because you're consuming more energy, and it's all equal. But as you become sedentary or you become older, you don't need as much energy. You're just spinning, the plate, so to speak. And so you don't need to add excess energy, which troubles me because a lot of people who have sedentary horses, they're still being fed like they're a racehorse. They're being fed inflammatory foods. They're fed sugar in excess or anything in excess. And remember, it's not just sugar. And we give sugar such a bad rep, but sugar is so vital to our thinking, to our brain to be working, that we have to have sugar every day. We can't go without sugar. If we go without sugar, if we put 0 sugar in our mouths, our body will convert protein over into sugar. And that's really common. So a lot of people who just cut out the sugar and they put them on soybean meal, they're surprised to find that sometimes the horse gets a little bit fatter because that sugar, because the metabolism's so wrong, that's broke down in sugar, and then insulin pops it into body fat, and you just keep feeding more and more, and they get fat on soybean meal. But that's more of an exception than the rule. Sometimes I lose my train of thought, so bear with me as I come back to this idea of energy balance. So we need to decrease the amount of sugar and limit it. So whatever the intake is going to be equal to whatever the output is. And that's a balancing act, because we are all nurturers and we all want to feed our horses our love. And we think that our horse is senior at 18 years of age, so we're buying senior feeds, or we're buying low starch feed, and you should just feed regular oats and cut it in half. But I digress. So how do we do that? Well, the easiest thing that you and I can do for ourselves and for our horses is to limit the amount of food that goes in. So we're going to decrease what's on the left side of the equation of intake, so it equals the output. But on the other hand, you could increase the output, and that'll do almost the same task. In fact, it's pretty interesting when you add exercise, what it does to metabolism. And it probably is the best way to approach an obesity epidemic. And yet I don't know how to do it in horses. You have treadmills, and I can't imagine how boring that is, but it certainly is better than just watching them, rot on the vine, so to speak, in a stall. They'll go outside. My horses are outside today, and something got them going. They ran all around the field and, kicking up their heels. And that's actually enough. That's what a horse needs to do. They need to get outside, kick up their heels, do something that will increase caloric consumption. But when you see that and they're huffing and puffing, you've just put in 30, 60, 90 minutes of exercise on your horse, and you feel you have to feed them, just step back and look at your horse. Is there excess body fat on the horse? Is the horse healthy? Are the suspensories not hot but cool after training? Is everything normal? And if it is, and you find that the exercise is causing the horse to lose body fat, then add some whole grain if you have to. That's what racehorses have done forever, but they are working their tails off. But if the horse is stall bound, why are you feeding grain? Why are you even feeding hay to these guys other than to keep them occupied? But if they're starting to gain body fat, subcutaneous body fat, there's a good chance they're also increasing their VAT or visceral adipose tissue. And there's no way that you and I can tell. When I say no way, I'm not sure if we have a solid way to look at it. Certainly, doing the AST and ALT tests on the liver functions can be helpful. But if it's normal, like it is in humans, normal is based on a bunch of sick people that they're taking the average. And you should actually be shooting for a lower number than normal to make sure that the liver's functioning properly. But I'm not an expert on that. I would love to have somebody help me out with that. I've said this before to some people about horses that are being prepared to go to an event, whether it's a show or a race, and they know that the morning routine is different. They're brought into a grooming stall, they're cleaned up, their hair is braided, boots are put on, shipping boots, whatever your routine is. They see the trailer that's outside being loaded up with tack, and they know they're going to a horse show or to an event where they're going to be exercising, competing. And during this whole time, the question you need to be asking yourself is, what fuel is the horse using at that moment? And they have a choice. They can use either fat or they can use glucose or sugar. And if the horse is normal and insulin resistance is not a problem, it's also called normal insulin sensitivity. If that's normal, then they're going to burn their fat to go through all this process and get to the starting gate, and they're going to be okay. And then when they have to race, they're going to dip into their sugar and use the sugar. Why is this happening? Well, to burn fat, you need oxygen. It is a very efficient way of doing things as long as you have all the ingredients in the kitchen, which is fat and oxygen in your mitochondria, and they will burn it cleanly and they will get a ton of energy off of it, and they can do whatever they have to do, such as breathe, walk, travel, interact, warm up, all that stuff. But when it comes down to where the oxygen is depleted because you're breathing so fast that oxygen exchange decreases, and that's called VO2 max. O2 is oxygen, and volume of oxygen, your maximum intake of oxygen comes in. When you get to that level, your mitochondria are going to switch from burning fat over to glucose. They're going to take your glycogen stored glucose and any free glucose that's out there. They're not only going to use those, but they'll even take glucose without insulin knocking at the door. It's called insulin independent glucose uptake. And they're going to take that glucose and use it to run for their lives. And what's interesting is if you've ever watched any sporting event, human or horse, where the horse or the human just works to exhaustion, where nothing works anymore. If you lift weights, you know what I'm talking about. You're lifting the weights and finally your arms just can't contract because they've gone to exhaustion. And what that means is glucose is used up. They're not getting enough oxygen into the blood to power up the mitochondria and use fat, and they've run out of glucose. And so you quit, and if you're being chased by a predator, you get eaten. Sorry about that. Bad example, but that's what happens. So as the workload goes up, you're going to decrease the utilization of fat, and you're going to increase the carbohydrate utilization. And if you're metabolically unfit, you or your horse, then the peak fat oxidation comes early and is low. So in other words, when you're starting to get the horse ready to go and they're getting excited and, they're pawing and, they're snorting a little bit, and you get on the trailer and they're on high alert, they're already dipping into their glucose because they can no longer use their fat. the engine that's supposed to run on two fuels, fat and sugar, has the inability, it's inflexible. Mitochondrial flexibility is all about switching back and forth between the two fuels. And if you can't do that because you're metabolically unfit, then you're going to burn up your glucose and you're not going to have the energy you need for your competition, and you're going to fade at the end. It's basically that simple. Interestingly, in humans, you can test VO2 max, but it's very difficult to do. You have to go to a lab. They have to seal your respiratory system off from the real world, and you breathe through a mask, and they measure everything that goes in and everything that comes out. It's pretty fascinating. And I hear that it's kind of painful to do, but there's a direct correlation between increasing your VO2 max, which is meaning you're metabolically fit, and decreasing all-cause mortality. So the more you increase your fitness, the decrease you have in most causes of death, which I thought was just fantastic. The other thing about exercise is muscle buildup. And remember, every muscle has partitioned off the pantry and the kitchen, if you will, where you store the glycogen. The glycogen can stay in there. It's basically glucose stored in a very efficient way. So when the race is on or the threat is seen, the horse can dip right into the glycogen stores and take the glucose, and bam, they've got fuel. They'll immediately switch over to it and they'll run for their lives. That's the way it's supposed to be. And by definition, if you increase muscle mass, you're going to increase the number of cabinets you have to store glucose in. It's that simple. So if you want to really get helping your horse, you need to decrease the amount of sugar that's coming in and increase the workload coming out. And that's going to get the equation equal on both sides. Calories in versus calories out. And that's the law of thermodynamics I've talked about, which you can't get away with. Every plant and animal on the planet deals with that because it's a universal law of physics. You can't create energy. It just changes form. And if you put in more energy than is needed, the body has a system for that. And that body basically says, I'm going to take this excess energy that you're giving me in the form of fuels. I'm going to store it as body fat. So you could be on a low sugar diet and eat a lot of fat. That's my problem. I love cheese. I love butter, and I eat probably more than I should. And so it will be stored as body fat. That's no big deal. But if I decrease the amount of butter and cheese that I ate and kept my sugar content low, then my mitochondria aren't going to be overworked, and the insulin is going to go back to normal levels, and the machinery is going to run like a well-oiled machine. Having a little excess body fat is good for you. It's actually being proved to be healthy. You don't want to be skinny, and you want muscle. Those are your two goals. You want them in your horse. You want them in your own body. The more muscle you have, the healthier you're going to be. It's going to protect you from falling down. It's going to be a disposal site for glucose. And what I mean by disposal site is, remember, glucose has to have a home. It's got to either be put in the muscle, used in the brain, or stored as fat. And if it's not being used up, it's got to be stored as fat. It's just the rule. And if your subcutaneous fat capacity is low, I'm going to call that possibly a hard keeper or just the thin long distance runner. There's a good chance that that excess calories is going to go into visceral fat, and that's what's going to set up inflammation, which you can measure, hopefully not too late, and change course. Prevent fatty liver disease. Just want to touch on two more things, and hopefully you're going to understand how important metabolic syndrome or having a good metabolic system is so important for all of us, our horses, our dogs, every animal on the planet. There are two other things, and I've mentioned these before. You want to decrease the stress on your horse. So if your horse is living in a pigsty, if there's no fan or no ventilation, it's a hot summer, or if it's cold and he's shivering and has to stay warm because body heat isn't enough, they're out in the cold. If they're turned out in a field of horses that are aggressive, and the horse at the bottom end of the totem pole, so to speak, or is the top end of the totem pole. But anyway, the hierarchy is down at the bottom. If you have barn help that's abusive, if you're abusive and you call your horse all sorts of names other than the name that you've given them, derogatory names like stupid or things like that I can't say on air, these are all stresses that the horse takes in. And I get to feel these stresses when I go see some of the horses, especially at new places. I'll go in and the horse is like looking at me, sees that I'm a man, I'm a vet, nothing good is going to come out of this. I should just run for the hills or fight. And then suddenly I take the pain away from his sharp dental points inside his mouth. And the transformation, the paradigm shift that these horses have is so obvious to the owners that some of them actually break down crying. They didn't know their horse could show this positive expression. But taking the sharp points away, making sure the hooves are taken care of, making sure the rain rot goes away, that you're grooming them, that you put a blanket on them if it's cold, if you keep the flies off them in the summer, put up 1, 2, 3 fans, whatever it takes to blow air on the horse so he can get away from the flies. All the things that you can think of to make this horse's life in a human world comfortable, that's what you need to do. Take their stress away. If you leave a light on in the barn, how can the horse get good sleep? I think there's a few people doing sleep studies in horses, and I know sleep, what do they call that in horses? Equine sleep disorder, I think they're calling it now. Where we used to call it narcolepsy, but that's not, because that's a lesion in the brain. But these horses just don't get enough REM sleep or whatever it is, and they just collapse. What's the cause of that? Well, they should be dark. I mean, it's gotten to the point where when I go to a hotel, I wear a mask. I put this sleep mask on and I block out all light, and it's made a world of difference in my sleep in a hotel. I can't begin to tell you, sleep is that important. But they found in humans, if they took a human and decreased their normal sleep by about 3.5 hours, which is basically, from 8 hours of sleep down to like 4.5, something like that. And they used them. It was a really good science. I won't get into the science of it. They showed that their cortisol levels went up, and their insulin levels, their insulin sensitivity dropped significantly. And so all you guys who can't sleep very well, it's affecting your insulin, it's affecting your metabolic health. Do something to change your sleep habits. Blacken the room, make it quiet. Don't turn on the blue light in front of you. Don't leave a TV on. Don't leave music playing. Don't leave a light on in the barn. Give these horses a place where they feel safe. So when they fall asleep, they can get good sleep. I think that's really important, and a lot of us don't even think about it. But if you decrease the sleep in humans, it increases insulin resistance and increases blood fats, blood lipids. So that's important. And I think I've covered everything. Reduce stress, get sleep in. I have another note down here. Liposuction basically sucks out subcutaneous fat, and yet these people with liposuction still die of cardiovascular disease because you haven't addressed the visceral fat. So now you have less fat stores. In fact, maybe with fat people, you need to add more fat, but so they get another place for the fat to go. It's just kind of funny how people do liposuction. It doesn't make them healthier at all. Okay, So I think I've done it 45 minutes. It's less than an hour. I think I've covered metabolic syndrome in horses based on metabolic syndrome in mammals/humans. And I think that while there may be some differences, such as the horse eats a pure vegetable diet of forage or grass, we can't compare them to humans at all because we eat other things. Even if we're vegetarians, I've yet to see a vegetarian eat nothing but grass. It just isn't going to happen. I mean, they could argue, well, we eat sprouted whatever, but they got to eat a lot of it. And remember that metabolic syndrome requires protein because protein helps to build muscles, and muscles will create more places for glucose to go, which will help decrease insulin resistance. So that's it in a nutshell. I promise you it'll be a little bit shorter. Yes, I went into some weeds. I get it. But I hope that helps. All right. As usual, come see me at thehorsesadvocate.com. Become a member. Join me for the every other Thursday night rounds where I get to talk about this again and again and answer your questions. It's really, it's a lot of fun. It helps me get it in my brain, and hopefully it'll get it in your brain. But if you don't have the capacity to want to remember this, just remember, if your horse has excess body fat, I wish there was a blood test that we could do, but if you were going to do anything, it would be an oral glucose tolerance test and check the liver functions and make sure that the horse is healthy that way. But if you don't have the money to do that, just ask yourself, is a horse able to run through the field and not quit early and sit there blowing and say they can't do anymore? That's a sure sign that your horse doesn't have mitochondrial flexibility. If you're feeding inflammatory ingredients, if you're feeding grain to a horse that's doing nothing, and the horse is gaining body fat, he or she's probably putting fat in the viscera, and you're going to get problems with insulin production and other inflammatory responses. And you don't want that. You want your horse to live a long life and be healthy, a health span, as we say. The horse may be dead at 15 because of whatever else, breaks a leg, but he'll be healthy at that point. And if he doesn't break a leg, maybe at 30 or 35 or 40, they're going to remain healthy. So don't freak out if your horse has a little extra body fat, but be aware that that fat could be in the viscera. And if it is in the viscera, there's not much you can do. You can do a muscle biopsy, look for intracellular fat. I don't know who's doing that. You can look at liver, do a liver biopsy. Very few people are doing that. It's very dangerous too. I mean, I'm going to say it's dangerous. It's invasive. Let's say that. But the simplest thing for everybody listening to this is stop feeding sugar in excess. Get that equation right. If your horse is running for his life every day at a racetrack, you're going to have to feed them some oats. But if the horse isn't doing that and is doing a good amount of exercise, but still is carrying extra body fat, just keep in mind that that body fat could also be visceral adipose tissue. And if that's the case, you're going to have insulin resistance. Such as a cressy neck. If you have a cressy neck, or the farrier says, the feet are a little warm or a little tender, tapping on the soles, these are huge warning flags. And in the beginning stages, I believe that insulin resistance is completely reversible. But you're going to have to work at it. You're going to either have to soak the hay, limit the pasture, add soybean meal as a source of protein just to make everything work, because everything is protein, and take away the stress and make it fun for the horse. And hopefully that turns your horse around, and then you'll tell some other people and they'll do the same thing. All right. Hopefully you all join me at thehorsesadvocate.com. If you're at the Horses Advocate Facebook group, private Facebook group, I dip in there every once in a while to give some ideas. I try and take some of the questions and bring them to the rounds if nobody's going to bring rounds. So I'll bring it there. So I openly discuss them. Read the ingredients label. Remember, if in humans, they say you should eat food that you can recognize with your eye. But if you have to read more than 2 or 3 ingredients and you can't pronounce the words, you shouldn't be eating it. They say don't eat processed foods, and yet almost every grain bag that you have, every treat bag, every supplement bag, if you look at the ingredients and it has 3 or more ingredients and you can't pronounce 1 or 2 of them, you really shouldn't be feeding them to your horse. Let's get this thing working. Let's help our horses thrive in a human world. And thank you again for being here. And I'll check in with you next week. Bye, y'all. Hey, everyone. Doc T here. Thank you for listening to my content. Would you do me a huge favor? Would you please subscribe, comment, like, thumbs up, and give a star review? However it's presented to you, I want you to do that. There's 2 reasons. The first, of course, is to improve this product. This way I know what you like, what you don't like, what I can improve upon, what topics you want me to cover. But more importantly, it's also going to help others find me. And by doing that, you are now engaged in this mission of helping horses thrive in a human world. By you helping, we can reach others. And that I would be so grateful for. And remember, go to thehorsesadvocate.com for updates on this information. Thehorsesadvocate.com. And again, thank you so much for being here. Doc T out.